Good evening. My name's Jonathan Mickey. I'm president of Kellogg College. I wanted to welcome everyone for coming along to this event this evening. And you can always tell when an event's an important event because there's somebody to actually introduce the speaker rather than just having to introduce themselves. And you can tell when it's an extremely important event when there's someone to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker. That's tonight. My role is to introduce the speaker. First, I'll just say very briefly why we've got this link between Kellogg College, University of Oxford, and Bletchley Park, those described those boards there. One is that one of our main degree programs in terms of the number of students and number of fellows in the college is in system security, and the person who really runs that, Professor Andrew Martin, in the audience, for years before the link had been taking his students down there, Bletchley Park, to show where it all began at computing. Secondly, one of the women codebreakers, Joan First, there's a picture from that first board, was a fellow of the college. And also got to declare a personal interest because my sister Caroline's here and our father Donald Mickey was one of the codebreakers there as well, as you'll see when you buy this book. Bottom, top right. So that's the last thing I want to say by way of introduction. The book, which is going to be talked about, there's copies there, heavily discounted price of £20, and you can get a signed copy, as I have, by the author, so you can solve your Christmas buying presents today. But now I'm going to introduce Sir David Brown, who's going to chair the event. Sir David is one of our fellows here at Kellogg College, and it was actually Sir David who suggested to me and Professor Andrew Martin over at Kellogg Lunch a few years ago that we should really form a link with Bletchley Park because of all these common interests. And so we did precisely that. And we've held these Bletchley Park weeks ever since. We also created a Bletchley Park Fellow, the first of which was Turing, obviously not Alan Turing, but Alan Turing's elder brother's son, Sir Dermot Turing. And 5 years ago, Bletchley Park were looking for a new chair of their trust, and I'm pleased to say they chose a Kellogg fellow, namely Sir Andrew Brown, and Sir David Brown. And so Sir David Brown is now not only Vining Tudor Fellow here at Kellogg, but also Kellogg's Bletchley Park Fellow. So, Sir Dave.
Well, thank you. Now, I'm not even going to wander off in the direction of the lectern there, because you give me a lectern and I'm likely to grab hold of it and then never leave it for the next half hour. And I'm very clear about whose talk this is, and he's sitting immediately to my immediate right here, Dr Joel Greenberg. But, President, I'm glad you've got confidence in me chairing this, because such a complicated arrangement of the real boss, and that's you, sir, introduces the quasi-boss, otherwise known as the fall guy if it all goes wrong, me, and Joel has to make the best of it, and therefore, and you were very clear with me when you explained to me the only thing that really matters in all this is that, David, you said, you have got to get this moved on, move the discussion on to drinks at the back of the room by 6:45, bang on. So now I know what's important, and I'm an engineer. So I can, at least I know what a plan really should be. That when reality doesn't cooperate, and it won't, then the plan has to be able to be easily flexed and under control. So, ladies and gentlemen, and Joel, here's the plan. That I'm just going to take about 90 seconds, maybe flex it to 2 minutes, to introduce Joel to you. Then I'm going to get off this lectern and go and sit where I can watch the slides. So I'm going to learn as well. Joel's then going to do the really intellectually interesting stuff, and I'm going to listen to that. And he thinks he's going to take about 20-25 minutes, but no pressure, so. Because the longer you actually take, the more content you deliver that's of interest in the process, and the shorter the time you have to subject yourself to penetrating questions. And Jonathan, you said Q's and A's, allowing time for Q's and A's. But let's be brave about all this. Let's say not just Q's, but conversations with everybody. So please, if you want to argue the toss with anybody, me or Joel, then do feel free to claim your academic freedom in Kellogg College of all places. And we will welcome that, won't we? This is an unrehearsed, won't we? So when Joel wraps up his talk, illustrated talk, and Joel will sit back down there, and I'll come back up here again, and I'll sense the mood in all of you. If you're thinking, no, we need a bit more provocation yet, David, before we're up for this, then I might just put a few questions to you myself until there's plainly restlessness amongst everybody, and as soon as I possibly can, then I'll go into classic, spot the person who wants to make the next intervention. So we'll use the you and me bit of this as the flexible concertina-like bit of the program, if that's all right. Anyway, you can see how well this is going to work, because that's 90 seconds worth. Now, Joel, well, Joel's biography, that's the subject of a book in itself, and he's the book writer, and I'm not. Therefore, I'm going to do the engineering specification style introduction. Joel, Dr. Joel, a PhD in numerical mathematics from the University of Manchester in the days when UMIST had not yet acquired the University of Manchester, is the way this old northerner standing here with the microphone chooses to think about it. 1973, I think. He then worked for the Open University for over 33 years and held a number of director-level management positions. He is, of course, a distinguished historian and author, specializing in signals intelligence and its impact on the two world wars. He's had 3 books published, 3, believe me, very important books published in this field of signals intelligence. The first 2 are the authorized biographies of 2 key figures in the story of SIGINT, Gordon Welshman and Alistair Denniston. And the third is the book he's going to be talking to us about this evening, the Bletchley Park Codebreakers in their own words. Now, I hardly need say that he knows his way around the Bletchley Park story very well indeed, and that the Bletchley Park Trust has consulted him on a number of key projects over the years, and that he is a distinguished member of the Bletchley Park Trust Historical Advisory Group. That's a snappy title for that group. I must have a word with the Chief Executive of Bletchley Park when we get back about changing that one. Oh, just cancel that, because I think this is being recorded, isn't it? And so Ian Stanton will watch this in due course. So Ian, I didn't mean it. And the purpose of that historical advisory group at Bletchley Park is to help us all ensure that historical integrity is maintained in the development of all exhibitions and interpretation of all the huge amount of space that we have at Bletchley Park. And historical integrity and true interpretation is what the independently funded, fully accredited Museum of Bletchley Park is all about. But then you probably know that, those of you who went on the Bletchley Park visit on Sunday last, those of you who've been to Bletchley Park at other times in other ways, and then those of you who haven't been to Bletchley Park at all yet, when you do, you'll think, what took me so long to make that decision to go there? And you will be walking in the company of around about 10,000 ghosts, friendly ghosts, and it feels that way walking in their footsteps. Right, without further ado, Joel.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Big thanks to Jonathan and Kellogg College more generally for inviting me. Cabby and all the staff here have been really nice and friendly. Thanks to all of them who helped to facilitate this. So you can see the title of this book, and the idea behind the book was to try and approach the Bletchley Park story in a slightly different way through letters, both that have been put in the public domain and letters that I acquired over a number of years through research, and see whether you could tell the story through the actual words of the people who were involved, rather than people like myself who take stuff and then put our own interpretation on it. But perhaps it's useful to start at the beginning. How did this story even come out? Because I'm sure everybody knows secrecy is one of the things that people are always intrigued about, and it was secret for a number of years. And I guess it all starts with Frederick Winterbottom, and incidentally, as this is Oxford, in maroon, I've put, whenever there's someone who's a Oxford man or woman, I've included the college that they were affiliated with, and there are a number of them. I did a talk like this at Cambridge. Equally, there were a number of people who are in this book who are Cambridge alumni. Winterbottom had a publisher who had contacts in the British government, and they didn't give him authority to write his book, but they didn't prevent him from writing his book, and Harold Wilson apparently had the final word. Now, people like myself first became aware of this in July '74. Winterbottom's book was serialized in the Sunday Telegraph. I actually read this article. I was just finishing doing postgraduate work in Manchester. It was the first time I personally ever saw a photograph of this gentleman, Alistair Denniston, and little did I know in 1974 I'd go on to write his biography. Winterbottom's book eventually came out later that year, wildly inaccurate in many ways. He wasn't party to how anything was done. He made many mistakes, but at least the secret was out, and many other people knew about it. But contrary to popular belief, people had written about it well before Winterbottom. Go back to 1967. David Kahn, the doyen of American writers in the field, wrote his eminent book, The Codebreakers, with some detail about how Enigma was broken during World War II. 1973, a book, Enigma, by Gustave Bertrand. Bertrand was a French intelligence officer who was involved in facilitating the sharing of information between the British, the French, and the Poles. He wrote his own account in 1973, never translated into English, so if you can read French, it's well worth having a look at. And then another interesting book about the spy Kim Philby in 1973. You wouldn't think that would be anything to do with Bletchley Park, yet there's a whole chapter in this book called The Golf Club and Chess Society. Now that was an amusing pun on the name of the organization at Bletchley Park, the Government Code and Cipher School, GCHQ, and there's a whole chapter devoted to Bletchley Park and what went on there during World War II, a full year before Winterbottom's book came out. In '77, we have the first book about the Polish contribution. This particular book is interesting because it contains several appendices written by the eminent Polish cryptanalyst Marian Rejewski, who was one of the three young Poles who were mentioned in one of the boards over there, who made the early breakthroughs in Enigma in the early 1930s. In 1978, the British government relaxed the restrictions on people who were involved in this stuff. A number of items, documents were released into the Public Records Office. That eventually turned into the National Archive in Kew, and this was in '78. And the rules were relaxed, so anybody who had worked at Bletchley Park or were involved in this stuff could say that they were there. They could actually say what their job was, and they could say what they knew about how the information, the decrypted messages, were used. But that was it. They weren't allowed to divulge anything technical at all. In 1979, another Polish book, the better of the two, The Enigma War by Joseph Garlinski. And finally, we have the first official history. The historian Harry Hinsley had been commissioned to write a multi-volume official history of British intelligence, and the first volume came out in 1979. In 1982, two very important books, which for the first time revealed how the people of Bletchley Park actually did what they did, particularly around breaking in the Enigma system. Gordon Welchman's book, The Hut 6 Story, and the biography, the definitive, in my view, biography of Alan Shearing, both with loads of technical information. Welchman got into considerable trouble with the authorities over this book. He wasn't authorized to do it. He'd moved to the United States. He thought he was immune from prosecution. Unfortunately for him, his life was made pretty miserable for the last 3 years of his life. He's also responsible inadvertently for something else. The subtitle of this book, Breaking the Enigma Codes, was actually added by McGraw-Hill, his publisher, unbeknownst to Welchman, and perhaps it has given rise to this unfortunate phrase, Enigma Code. There is no such thing as the Enigma Code. Enigma is a cipher system, not a coding system at all. And people like myself get annoyed every day when I read someone refer to it as the Enigma Code, because I'm afraid it doesn't exist. In 2003, people like myself suddenly had a plethora of information. The National Archives, the Library of Congress in Washington, the Churchill Archive Center, of which I have gifted most of the material that was included in this book last November, have a wealth, since 2003, a wealth of information from researchers to have a look at. Members of the general public, you don't have to be an accredited academic to look at this stuff, and there's an awful lot of it. In 2010, we get the official view from MI6. MI6 was closely linked to the Government Code and Cipher School. In fact, there was the head of MI6, or SIS as it was known during the war, oversaw both. He was actually the director of both the Secret Intelligence Service and the Government Code and Cipher School. The Government Code and Cipher School then had its own head. Its first head was Alistair Denniston. Now, I started to get seriously involved in this stuff around that time when I undertook a biography of Gordon Welchman. I contacted his family. Someone gave me the contact details, and I met them in the center. We have Nick Welchman, Gordon Welchman's son, Rosamond Welchman, one of his two daughters. This is Linda Welchman, Nick's wife. They live in the United States, and remarkably, Gordon Welchman, when he got into difficulties with the intelligence community in the United States after publication of his book, got very nervous around 1985, some months before he died, that he might be raided. He had been visited by the FBI, members of the National Security Agency, so he took all of his personal documentation, papers, everything he had to his son, and stored it in his loft. And there it sat for over 25 years. His son, being a research librarian by trade, decided he wouldn't throw it out, despite protestations from his wife, who wanted him to throw it out, and he kept it all those years and gave it all to me. Rosamond also had material, including personal diaries. Their other daughter had material as well. Brought it all back to the UK, and that gave rise to a subsequent book. In the same way, the families of Alistair Denniston, the first head of the Government Code and Cipher School, so in effect, the first head of GCHQ. It became GCHQ towards the end of the war. There they are at the launch of my book. Members of his family, they also had quite a lot of material as well. So obviously that proved very, very useful in producing these two books, a wealth of information that I could use, and a lot of it very original material. Welchman was quite an interesting character, as I was saying to someone earlier. When he started working on the Hut 6 story, he started writing to former colleagues, and not only did he keep every letter he got back, he had a copy of every letter he sent on the old transparency paper, very difficult to read. It took me a long time to read these hundreds and hundreds of letters, but it was an extraordinary amount of material. And anyone who wants to see it can now visit the Churchill Archive Center and see it under the name of the Gordon Welchman Papers. In 2020, we have another very important book, certainly to people like myself, from at last, GCHQ revealed information previously unknown to historians like myself, an official authorized history by the eminent Canadian historian John Ferris, which again has proved invaluable in subsequent work that I have done. Just to give you some idea of the number of books out, this is just one of my bookshelves at home. This is just a part of my personal collection of books about Bletchley Park and related intelligence activities across from the beginning of World War I through to the end of World War II, and that's just a part of it. So the letters themselves, as you can see, some of them were typewritten, some of them were handwritten, hundreds and hundreds of them. So they formed the basis of this book, along with a number of letters that had been officially released. GCHQ released them into the Public Records Office and then at the National Archives in Kew. The difference between the personal letters is there was no one from the intelligence community looking over the shoulders of the authors when they were writing these letters. They were corresponding with each other, and while many of them would not, until their dying day, would not speak about what they did at Bletchley Park or related activities to each other, they felt no obligation to not, they said, whatever they wanted, warts and all. And some of it is quite interesting, the failures as well as the successes. Now, a number of the authors of the letters are the better known figures. These four gentlemen, all Welchman, Denison, Dilly Knox, very well known. In fact, Knox is probably the only person involved in this stuff who was quite happy to write a letter being outrageous in his language, knowing that it would be read by everybody. He didn't seem to care. William Friedman, the doyen of American cryptanalysts, a number of his letters are included as well. But for the rest of this talk, I'm not going to talk about these people because they're reasonably well known. Part of the idea of writing this book was to bring to the fore the people, the foot soldiers, the people who actually did the work and no one's heard of. And some of them did phenomenal things. And part of the idea of the book is to bring them to the notice of the public. Starting with Peter Caressi, Balliol College. He headed the Air Intelligence Section in Bletchley Park during the war. And when Gordon Welchman decided to write his book, initially the idea is that it would be co-authored with Cavell Caressi and Stuart Milner Barry, later Sir Stuart Milner Barry. Milner Barry was Welchman's deputy in a section called Hut 6. Cavell Caressi was in a section called Hut 3. And together they were going to write this book. Cavell Caressi decided he couldn't do it unless he had access to official records, which were with the official historians. He wasn't allowed access. Stuart Milner Barry was still working. He was compiling the civil list. He felt he'd be compromised if he got involved. So in the end, Welchman had to go on his own. Caressi was very stubborn. He was a senior editor at Penguin. He lobbied Joe Hooper, who was a former colleague, former veteran at Bletchley Park. He went on to be director of GCHQ. He's a Worcester College man. Again, Hooper told him, no, we can't release anything to you. He wrote to the letters of the editor, saying that this was foolish. In the end, he gave it up, and in 1980, he wrote a little book called Top Secret Ultra, which stuck strictly by the rules laid down by the Foreign Secretary, Dr. David Owen, and he restricted himself to what he did and how the intercepted messages were used, and he wouldn't go any further than that. Another Oxford man, Peter Twin. Twin was the first mathematician recruited in the modern era by the Government Code and Cipher School before they arrived at Bletchley Park. He's largely credited with making the first break of a real operational Enigma encrypted message in the United Kingdom in 1939. He too wanted to tell his own story, and he was thwarted from doing so. He approached former colleagues, Bill Bonsall, who went on to be a director of GCHQ. Interesting enough, at Bletchley Park, Twin was Bonsall's superior. Twin was more senior than Bonsall. They both stayed on at GCHQ, and Bonsall rose to the much higher rank of director. Bonsall invited him to lunch and was very friendly, but said, nope, sorry, we can't release anything to you. He then lobbied Sir Brian Tovey, Bill Bonsall's successor. Same thing, sorry, another Oxford man, I can't give anything to you. And finally, his successor, Sir Peter Mary Church, who equally said no. So Twin was thwarted in his efforts. And interestingly enough, he got contacted by Harry Hinsley. The letter is in the book. Hinsley, as I said, was the official historian, headed up the team that wrote the official history. He had included in his first volume a technical appendix, which was a limited amount of technical information. He didn't give proper accreditation to the early Polish work in the 1930s, and a lot of people were very unhappy with the accuracy of it. And so he wrote to Twin and said, could he help? And they also dispatched Joan Clark to Twin, to speak to Twin. Joan Clark had been enlisted to try and rewrite this technical appendix. She had been a leading cryptanalyst, one of the top women. There weren't many senior women cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. She was certainly one of them, possibly become famous because she was briefly engaged to Alan Turing, but that should take nothing away from the fact that she was one of the top cryptanalysts working at Bletchley Park. She brought with her a classified document which Twin had written along with 3 other colleagues who were included in this book as well, an end of a war report. And Twin looked at this and he couldn't remember half of it. He couldn't even understand stuff that he'd written. And it led him to be very skeptical about anyone who claimed 40 years after the war to remember exactly what they did or exact details. Very skeptical indeed. And I've actually seen that document and it is quite indecipherable. Twin then started to speak to Dennis Babbage and Gordon Welchman. Babbage was one of the top cryptanalysts working for Welchman, and Twin, Welchman, and Babbage in the correspondence in the book start to try and put the picture together, talking to each other, remembering, misremembering. And that's what is interesting about it, I think. No one person can remember it all, but together they're trying to piece the story together, and they can be quite blunt, they can be critical of anyone because they're writing personal correspondence. And someone like me comes along years later and the family say, yeah, sure, publish it, we don't care. I think this particular round of correspondence between Twin, Babbage, and Welchman is very interesting. Harold Fletcher, another totally unknown person to, I would guess, every single person in this room. He was recruited by Welchman into Hut 6. In case you aren't aware, the wooden huts, they started building wooden huts. All they had was an old mansion house and some cottages and a stable yard. They started building these wooden huts and they started numbering them, 1, 2, 3. The group that Welchman headed, which decrypted German Army and Air Force communications, was put in hut number 6. This is the modern day Bletchley Park with it restored, with the bomb blast walls restored. And they became known as Hut 6. So when they moved to a bigger bomb-proof building, and you can see the part of the building that they occupied, they remained Hut 6. So of course they had to rename Hut 6, Hut 16, etc., because as they moved on, they all kept these hut names. And there you can see a picture of the front of them. So you see they had quite a bit of space. And Fletcher was responsible for all the administration, everything, recruitment, welfare, everything to do with all the people involved in this part of the operation. He had an even bigger job because there was a machine that was developed initially by Turing, then Welchman contributed significantly to it, which assisted in decrypting the German communications, the Enigma communications. By the end of the war, about 211 of the machines, most of them not at Bletchley Park. They were in outstations around the country, in London, Eastcote, Stanmore. And of course, different groups wanted access to the machines for the particular things they were working on. So there was a lot of competition for machine time, to use modern computing parlance, and Fletcher was responsible for administering all of that. Margaret Rock was very elderly when she arrived at Bletchley Park. She was 37. Most of the women at Bletchley Park arrived 19. At the end of the war, they were recruiting 18-year-olds, and Margaret was actually 37 when she arrived in 1940. She worked for Dilly Knox in this part, one of the original cottages, which still stands to this day. It's, I think, still by the Bletchley Park Trust as offices. This was the Dilly Knox, famous cryptanalyst who'd been involved in World War I, here pictured with Margaret Rock during the war. Knox died in 1943. And they were situated in here. Now, Margaret Rock went on to stay on in GCHQ, so of course she never ever spoke about, until she died in the 60s, what she did at Bletchley Park. However, she felt quite at ease writing to her mother about her personal life, and a number of letters where she'd gone to London to visit family, and the difficulty of returning from London to Bletchley Park by train during the Blitz and bombs and hiding in air shelters and under a railway bridge until they were told to get on the train is one of the more interesting, totally non-technical aspects of the book, I think. Keith Beatty was one of the top cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. Again, someone you might not know, but many of you will have heard of his more famous wife, Mavis Beatty. Keith was very reticent to speak. He always pushed his wife Mavis Mavis Lever during the war. They married and met and married at Bletchley Park, and he was more than happy not to talk about it at all. He stayed in the background. Yet he worked on an extraordinary number of machines and broke many of them. Now, one of the difficulties for both the Germans and the Allies, and it cuts both ways because the British and the Americans also had their own encryption devices, was that the device needs to be secure, but it needs to be usable by the operators. Enigma fit that bill. Enigma was quite straightforward for the operators to use, but it had vulnerabilities. Now, this isn't a technical talk, so I'm not going to describe those technical vulnerabilities whatsoever. You feel free to ask me if you want more technical information. So the British, mainly due to operator error, managed to break all these variants. Towards the end of the war, the Germans were going to replace it with this device, the SG-41. Keith Beatty was put on it, couldn't break it, could make no headway whatsoever, but the war ended before it could be deployed. In any event, it was too difficult for the operators to use. So in this work, there's a continual balance between the ability of the machine to do its job, but equally the people to use it. And that was a problem for both sides during the war. Pat Bailey was a countryman of mine, a Canadian who was very closely involved in the activities at Bletchley Park. He was recruited to something called the British Security Coordination, BSC, that was set up by MI6 in New York City in the Rockefeller Center. It was authorized by Prime Minister Churchill himself, and their job was to protect British interests, to protect Britain against exposure to spying, particularly in the Americas, and also to propaganda, to actually plant propaganda before the United States came into the war, to seed stories which would then appear in the American press, etc. Bailey also ran something called Camp X, which was in Canada, and they trained spies, both Allied spies who were then parachuted into Europe. Bailey also was involved in bringing Alan Turing to America. Turing went over to America to assist on a number of different developments, and Turing actually stayed with Bailey. Now, these people had so much power. Their cover was the British Passport Office. And so notice they were handing out passports. And there's a nice story, not in this book, I was just telling, where suddenly it was decided that they needed Turing back in England. And it was usually quite a lot of bureaucracy. In fact, Turing's visa had expired, or his passport has expired. And the word came, we need him back in England. And Turing, Bailey took him to the docks, and he was boarding a ship 12 hours after the request arrived, because this chap had so much power. And Turing, apparently, according to Bailey, just said to him, I hope I didn't cause you too much trouble. And Bailey had managed to organize all of this in 12 hours, and Turing was on a ship back to Britain. A part of the Bletchley Park operation and the war effort by the Allies, which is very rarely talked about, is British communications. It's all well and good to talk about us reading German communications, Japanese communication. We needed to secure our communications. And Bailey developed a device which was used by MI6 and others called the ROC-X, which the enemies of the UK and America never broke, to encrypt British communications. He was involved, along with Welshman and Turing, in developing another device, the RM26, also known as the Mixmaster, because of its weird shape. This was a prototype, which is actually in the museum at GCHQ. It never saw the light of day. This is all there is, this one prototype of it. It was going to be a very sophisticated, complex machine, but it never got off the design table. Max Newman, we're getting closer to the heart of the president of Kellogg College, Max Newman. Newman was an eminent mathematician. He wasn't recruited initially to Bletchley Park because he had German ancestry, and there were some possible concerns about it. He was an eminent mathematician at Cambridge. He was one of Alan Turing's lecturers, and by all accounts, he, more than anyone, was responsible for Turing becoming interested in the notion of computable numbers and computing machines, and even contributed to Turing's famous paper on computable numbers. I won't try and pronounce the Entscheidung problem part of the title of that paper. Eventually, Newman was recruited in 1942, and thanks to St. John's College, who have the Max Newman papers, they released to me all of the correspondence given to them by Max's son, William, which show his entire recruitment process, from first approach by someone at Bletchley Park, and then every letter showing how he came to work at Bletchley Park, and then at the end when he left, also when he had to resign from his chair at Cambridge, and right down to when he actually quit and went back to Cambridge at the end of the war, went to Manchester at the end of the war to become head of the mathematics department. Now Newman took a number of ideas that had been developed by people like Bill Tutt and John Tiltman, two famous figures at Bletchley Park, and he mechanized them. He led the team that developed these two devices, or conceived these two devices, one called Robinson, and Donald Mickey was involved with this sort of work as well. This machine was hugely problematic. It employed something, something called paper tape. This is actually a piece of paper tape of one of these devices that years ago. And everything was punched on these. It had to run around on this spool. The tape kept on breaking. The Robinson, named after the cartoonist Heath Robinson, didn't work very well. But then they approached the British Post Office. An engineer called Tommy Flowers and a small team produced the Colossus, arguably the world's first electronic computer. There were 10 by the end of the war. And they ran off not chips, but these things. Thermionic valves. This wasn't on a wartime Colossus machine, but they are still lying around. I've got a number of them that were given to me by the people who work on the Colossus machine. 2,500 of these. The thing processed at about, for those of you that are computing geeks, 5,000 characters a second. Unbelievably slow by any notional. And all of the concepts about data and everything, nothing, the language of modern day computing. But it was hugely successful, as was the bomb machine in helping with the Enigma. Breaking of Enigma. These were tools that were used. They didn't on their own. You didn't feed in the encrypted message and out popped the decrypted message. They helped solve part of the machine setup. No, they were just tools that were used. But Donald Mickey comes into the picture, a young man of 19, when he joins Bletchley Park. Now you're about a man, although he didn't get very far initially because he I believe he wanted to do Japanese work and there were no places, so he got involved in this stuff. And eventually he got involved with the Colossus machines as well, and along with his colleague Jack Good and others, they tried to change what the machine could do. They tried to add to the functionality of it. So in theory, they were programming it, but not in any modern day concept. Anyone who's old enough to remember analog computers, maybe that'll give you some idea, with plugs and patch cables, etc., making the machine do things which the developers of it hadn't really conceived. And it was hugely successful as well. Now, another interesting side of the Donald Mickey story, and I can't resist saying that given that my host is his son, is the famous Alan Turing's silver. Now, this story has been written about. Interesting enough, again, I was saying to someone, Donald's daughter earlier, those of us who are honest accept that we make mistakes, like all historians, because you write things on your best knowledge, information at the time. It was generally assumed that it was known that Alan Turing, along with Gordon Welchman and a chap called Hugh Alexander, had been given a £200 cash award by the Foreign Office for their work at Bletchley Park during the war. It was generally assumed that Turing then used his money to buy silver and then hid it near Bletchley Park. Not quite true, because I uncovered Gordon Welchman's diary, and it turns out that this award was in July 1941. Turing bought his silver a year earlier in 1940, so he already had the money to do it. He hid the silver in a couple of miles from Bletchley Park, along with a lot of money. He went back. He did this in 1940. He went back in 1944, bizarrely recovered the cash, but still left the silver there. And then he enlisted Donald Mickey's help in 1946 to try and find the silver, and he offered him a deal, a third of the proceeds or a daily rate. And quite wisely, Donald Mickey said, "I'll take the daily rate because I don't think you're going to find it." Turing went back a second time. He made his own metal detector, still failed to find it. In 1952, he bought an expensive commercial device. He went back again, still didn't find it. Roll forward to 1998, and I discover in the British Library the Donald Mickey papers, correspondence from a chap called Charles Affleck, again raising this whole issue of finding the silver with maps and ordnance survey, a detail and everything. And Donald Mickey said, "Yeah, sure, I'll take a third of the proceeds if you find it." But then they discovered that it would not be if they did find it, it would not be classified as treasure trove. Therefore, they wouldn't be able to keep it even if they found it. So I think that was probably the end of the silver story. And it shall lay there forever. I believe it's concreted over a bridge on top of it. So alas, it'll never be found. But all of that correspondence is in the book as well. Now, I had so much stuff. Clearly, I couldn't put it all in the book. My publisher said, well, we could do 2 volumes. But those of you that write books know that multi-volume books. The first volume sells, no one buys the second and third volume. So we put the best stuff in, but it seemed a shame. I've got quite an elaborate website, so I put a lot of the stuff in there. For example, a number of really interesting letters from Alistair Denison to his wife, Dorothy, when he was traveling in the Middle East, looking at various facilities that the Allies were using. Fascinating reading. All sorts of letters from former Polish cryptanalysts about early Polish developments and their relationship with Bletchley Park. These ones are quite technical, so it's just as well that I left it out. But they're all available for more technical people to read. And finally, a lot of correspondence by Keith and Mailer's, the famous Mavis Beatty and her husband Keith in later life, because they engaged with a number of British historians about the early breaks of Enigma, particularly involving Peter Twin, and there was a lot of correspondence about what had been done and what hadn't been done. So that is all in the book as well. Okay, well, I think that's probably close to 25 minutes. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I will stop there and we'll move on to the, and obviously available to take questions. I'm under Sir David's guidance how we proceed.
Well, and well done with your timing, and I think straight away, ready and done. Shall I ask the first question or no, sir?
What evidence is there that British communications were never decrypted? British and American communications?
A lot of British and American communications were decrypted. The British Navy codes were broken regularly by the Germans. The Germans had about 9 different equivalents of Bletchley Park, so it was a bit fragmented. But the most effective was called the BDenst, and they regularly broke the British naval codes until late 1943. So they were all the ships were, which is why the U-boats were so successful. But eventually, they didn't break most of the Army and Air Force communications, which were encrypted with a device called the Type X, which was developed by the British. British bought an Enigma machine in the 1920s. It was a commercial machine, anyone could buy them. Brought it back to Britain, decided it wasn't secure enough, so 2 gentlemen in the Air Force built a thing called Type X, and in fact, which was never broken by the Germans. In fact, the Type X could be converted to work just like an Enigma machine. So when people at Bletchley Park were decrypting Enigma encrypted messages, they were using Type X machines, not Enigma machines. There were a few at Bletchley Park. So yeah, other British codes were broken as well. Definitely.
Okay.
So why didn't the Navy use the Army and the RS communications?
Well, the myth that was circulated for years was that the Navy was a senior service and there was no way that they were going to use a machine developed by the Air Force. That's nonsense. There just weren't enough Type X machines to go around. It was as simple as that. The Air Force was using it, and eventually they got production up and eventually started putting Type X machines on board ships. But that wasn't until '44. And at that point, they'd already changed the code books and made them much more rigorous so the Germans couldn't break them. It's simple, there just weren't enough of them about.
Well, he says it's simple. Does it sound simple?
So how long would it take to make a Type X machine, considering we were rolling off tanks and airplanes off the production line, tens of thousands per year, but there weren't enough Type X machines to put on Navy ships until 1944?
Well, that was the problem. You have to prioritize materials. They're building these bomb machines as well, and a bomb machine cost, I can't remember the detail. People have done comparisons between what it cost to build a bomb machine and build a Lancaster bomber, and they're not far out of line, in terms of what they cost. So that's why there were never bomb machines. That's why it took ages to get the Colossus machines, and the only reason they eventually got a lot of bomb machines is because the company that built the bomb machine, the British Tabulating Machine Company, which became ICL, David's, I believe, former company, they turned almost the entire factory over to building bomb machines. And so they were able to ramp up production quite quickly. Colossus machines were built by the British Post Office in Dolwell Hill in London, and they managed to produce 10 quite quickly. But yeah, it was a constant prioritization of raw materials, and for whatever reason, the complexity, all of the wheels in the Type X machine were hand wired, but then so were the drums, as they were called, which replicated Enigma wheels on the bomb machine, were all hand wired. It takes a long time to do that. So,
Okay.
yeah,
So you had to lean on the private sector.
very much so, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
And am I right in thinking, Joel, that they were pretty big into recycling as well then, that as one generation of technology gave way to the next, then they didn't just throw the old stuff in a tip somewhere, that they recycled that then into the next generation and the next and the next, and it was a classic story of what we think of today as really very modern production engineering, designing. What do we call it these days? Readiness for manufacturing level, and then manufacturing readiness for recycling, and today just has the somewhat snappier description of the circular economy. But it was a needs must then, and the need then was to keep the supply of the most precious chunks of technology and raw materials, and steel even, very basic stuff, and copper. Go on.
That's why one of the more amusing myths around Bletchley Park was that Churchill at the end of the war ordered all, particularly the Colossus machines, to be smashed up, all the bomb machines to be destroyed, etc. The trouble with that theory is that the bomb machines and Colossus computers were still around until the end of the war with Japan. Well, those of you know your British history, Winston Churchill was not Prime Minister at the end of the war, so they couldn't have ordered that. And why would they smash up all these machines? Wrens, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service at the end of the war, were literally taking apart all of the components of the bomb machines and taking out all the wire to reuse. And I think there is still some in the museum at Bletchley Park, some of the original bits of wire. Why would you throw this stuff away and smash it up? They were reusing every single component that they could.
Copper wire.
Yeah.
Still to this day.
Yeah, there's another story which is
Copper.
very contentious, is that most people assume that the Colossus machines were dismantled. In fact, I think one of these boards who said something to that effect, said that they were unidentifiable. Well, unfortunately, while people believe that, there was another train of thought, because there is a stream of documents in the National Archives that show that Max Newman arranged at the end of the war to have 2 Colossus machines in their entirety moved to the University of Manchester. And all he did was take apart some of the components to make it not clear what these devices were used for, and even down to the size of the lorries. When the 2 lorries left Bletchley Park, when they arrived at the University of Manchester and unloaded, but nobody at Dulles Hill was told about this, not even Tommy Flowers, who designed the Colossus computers. So it's a bone of contention between historians about whether this is true or not, but many of us believe, and the historians of Manchester believe as well, that the very first Manchester computers that were developed there have serious components from the Colossus computer, had components from the Colossus computers in them.
So the Colossus wasn't rebuilt in its entirety at Manchester?
No.
Okay.
No, they wouldn't have done that. But with the tape going around, the thing called the bedstead, it was called bizarrely, that the tape went around at 5,000 characters a second, they were kept intact and would have been reused. A lot of the components, valves, all sorts of other stuff.
And what of the gin then, that was used to precisely engineer the delay in the delay lines in those early finite state machines?
Yeah.
Do you know the story of Turing and the gin, and why? Well, that's why Bletchley Park shop, by the way, sells an awful lot of Codebreaker gin there. You know the story?
Not really.
Oh, you don't? Oh, well. Well, here's Brown's version of it, and there's another trustee of Bletchley Park sitting at the back there, Oxford Professor Andrew Martin. Say hello, Andrew. He knows more about this sort of thing than I'll ever know, but here goes nothing. So, in those early-ish days of electronic computing, in the move from analog to electronic computing, when, as you were saying earlier, the analog-ish valves, the triodes and the diodes that were the operational amplifier valves of the time, the EF80s and EF85s. See, I'm older than that, look, even. Those valves, the only way you could get all the logic circuits all lined up so that the various bits of timing signals all arrived at the same place at the right time, which is a trivial thing to do really these days in a fully digital architecture. You just need a system clock and everything falls in line with the clocking of it. But not then. You had to hold back signals from particular bits of the computer so that they didn't arrive too soon, otherwise they would be missed. And the way that was done was by building yourself a box, like typically up to about 1 meter long, and a cross section like that, sometimes with a lid on, sometimes not, usually lined with tin or lead or something, and you would fill it with liquid and adjust the length of an internal shutter in it and almost tune the box, and so you whack a signal in one end, and the further it had to travel through liquid rather than excellent conductors like copper and so on, the further it had to travel, then the longer it took to get to the other end. So a bit like a trombone, you can alter the note that comes out of the horn at the end of it. And well, the materials that classically were used were chemicals and elements like mercury, which were in very short supply in the war, and this was limiting how many of these electronic computers they could build, colossi, and then to build. And Turing bent his mind to it, and he thought, well, won't alcohol do the job just as well as some of these rare production stuff? So he tried all kinds of alcohol that was in short supply in the war as well, particularly spirits. And he worked out that if you just stilled your own gin, using whatever was around, old potato peelings or whatever, and you made it the correct degree of proof, then it was a wonderfully sustainable and probably fully recyclable way of building a delay line. And that, who knows how much of the detail of that is apocryphal, how much is not, but certainly the basis of it is correct. And one day, so when you find the letter which corroborates at least some of it, will you let me know? Yeah. So that's the gin. Now I wish I'd never asked you the question.
Yeah, that's all right, yeah.
Who'd like to ask a more relevant question? Oh, madam.
To just move the conversation more to the personal side of things, I was interested, you were talking about the Welshman family and how they'd gone to America, and that they were frightened of the American Secret Service being interested in keeping the secrets at that end of things. It took me by surprise. That, could you say something more?
This is something of a paper I've just written actually, which I'm about to publish. The problem was that Welshman published his book, and he went beyond what the British government said veterans of Bletchley Park could do. He'd become an American citizen. He was doing research for the American government. He was representing the MITRE Corporation. We were doing work for the Air Force. And in effect, if you want to secure a bank, who better to hire than the best bank robber? So who better to hire to secure American Air Force communications than the guy who led the team that broke German Air Force communication during World War II? And so that is what he was doing. So he thought, MITRE were very supportive of his book, but he immediately got visited by members of the National Security Agency, the FBI, and he was told that there was a joint British-American treaty which meant that he was subject to prosecution in the United States for divulging classified information. And that is what was believed, and that is what I put in my biography of Welchman, and that was why he became so paranoid. They never prosecuted him in the end. His advice was they won't prosecute you. He was never prosecuted in Britain. He was never brought to court. No charges were ever brought against him, but of course, the family thought he could have been subject to 10 years in prison and a large fine, so that's why they were so nervous. Now, I discover, it was about 2-3 years ago, I got approached by a chap called Bruce Lee, who had been the publishing editor who had published Welchman's book, The Hut Six Story. He was elderly, he'd come across my book and read it, and he thought I'd want to know the true story. Welchman in his book added a final chapter about lessons today, lessons to be learned from his wartime experience, and he was pointing out all of the mistakes that the Americans had made, American Air Force in the Vietnam War, and that lives and airplanes were lost due to poor security communication. And it turns out that that is what angered the American authorities. Nothing to do with technologies at Bletchley Park, and that is why they came down on them so hard. And equally, in this country, the view was that GCHQ were unhappy with Welchman because he had divulged all of these secrets. It turns out not at all. It was simply that Welchman's book came out in the middle of the Falklands War, 1982, shortly after the sinking of the Belgrano. And it was very controversial because the whereabouts and the direction of the Belgrano had been determined by signals intelligence. So the last thing that the British government wanted in 1982 was a book talking about signals intelligence during World War II and bringing the whole area. People would then start asking the wrong questions. And the proof of that is that not many years after the war, suddenly Welchman has gone from being a pariah to a hero. He's a revered figure in GCHQ. He's a revered figure in the National Security Agency. So that is proof that, but at the time, the family didn't know that, and they assumed he could be sent to prison at any time.
Thank you, Joel. The gentleman, yeah.
Building on that question, I'm wondering to what extent do the letters betray different opinions about secrecy itself, or was everybody towing the line? And also, perhaps on a more personal basis, the impact of keeping secrets on people's lives?
I think that there is a differing view. I mean, there are those like Peter Cavell-Koreski and Peter Twin who thought, and Sir Stuart Milner-Barry wrote a famous letter to the editor after Welchman had died, saying it is ridiculous that this stuff has been kept secret. It'd be like, talking about people using bows and arrows, in context of modern warfare. But as the former departmental historian at GCHQ who wrote the foreword to the book said, in what position was Milner-Barry in to make that pronouncement or to make that judgment? That the concern of the intelligence community, like GCHQ and NSA, is that it isn't so much the technologies, it's the way they're used, the mindset of the people. The techniques haven't really changed that much. That's what they're sensitive about. Remarkably, in the foreword, his criticism of his former employer is that they didn't articulate that very well and didn't make that clear that that is the concern. So people just assumed that it was about the technical niceties of how the bomb machine worked, which is completely irrelevant in modern technological terms. You can get an emulator of a bomb machine. I've got an emulator of an Enigma machine on my phone. You can have an emulator of a bomb machine or the Colossus on your phone, which works perfectly well. So it's not the technologies, it's the way people operate. But at the time, the people involved who were most vociferous in wanting to tell their story believed that. They didn't think that that was the case. They thought that there were lessons to be learned and they were all getting older and were dying one by one, and the real story needed to be told before they were all gone. That was Welchman's driver. It wasn't about making money. I mean, Winterbottom made a lot of money, but I think he's the only one who ever did from writing books about Bletchley Park, myself included. You don't make money. You don't make money writing these books. It's just to bring history to life. And in the letters, you definitely see a difference of view. Joan Clark being hugely critical of Welchman in a letter to Peter Twin, and Twin likewise to her, hugely critical of him for producing this book.
Well, thank you. Now, my trusty analog watch here tells me there's time for one last question. Professor Martin.
Joel, thanks for a fascinating talk. You've assembled a lot of primary evidence from that era. And of course, there are other sources. There are the oral histories at Bletchley, there's the declassified material from GCHQ. Do you think there's any more primary evidence out there remaining to be found, or have we got it all? And if we have got it all, is there anything missing that you wish we'd preserved.
Well, there's nothing more forthcoming from those involved for obvious reasons. If you're good at mathematics, you can deduce that in 1945 they reduced the recruitment age of women to 18. So if you were 18 in 1945, you'd be 96 today. So unfortunately, there are no survivors. And even so, their memories wouldn't be up to it. No, there is a lot more to come out. The two of the most important parts of the Bletchley Park operation, which I didn't talk about today because of limited time. One was something called traffic analysis, where when messages were encrypted, particularly Enigma messages, there was a lot of information at the beginning called the preamble, which wasn't encrypted, like something called a call sign, which is in effect the telephone number of the group sending the message and those receiving it, the frequencies, etc. That information, along with radar and direction finding equipment, could give you a huge amount of information about the order of battle of the German forces, the disposition of the troops, etc. And there was a massive operation at Bletchley Park analyzing this traffic, totally classified until about 2019, when the material has finally been released, but there's thousands of pages of it, and the former historian has been given the unenviable task of producing into something more digestible. When I wrote my book about Alistair Dennison ended up in London, head of the diplomatic and commercial traffic group. The postal reports of that effort are all totally classified, never been released. GCHQ released one chapter of that report to me for my book about Dennison, but it just has general information. And again, for the very reasons that to this very day, GCHQ is reading the communications of all of our allies as well as all of our enemies, and the techniques that are used to analyze, particularly diplomatic commercial traffic, are exactly the same techniques that were used in World War II. So it's very, very sensitive, and so there's no evidence that that'll ever be released. I'm sure there might be diaries hidden in or secretly found in the years. Not many people kept diaries, not many people kept notes. People like Welshman walked away without one scrap of paper. Welshman wrote his book completely from memory without any access to anything. So, but there are still official material. There's still official material which is being held back, and perhaps one day will be released.
And 500 oral histories about to date in the archive in Bletchley Park.
Yeah, but again, the oral histories have to be taken in the same way as these letters have to be taken.
Yes.
There's a health warning on the letters. I have interviewed and met countless veterans who have told me with absolute certainty something which I knew with absolute certainty was simply not true. But you just smile and nod because you say, well, you didn't work in the section that happened, or what you're reporting, like I saw Alan Turing did such and such, and you don't want to say, well, actually Alan Turing wasn't even at Bletchley Park when you're saying that happened. But some stuff is fascinating, and it gives you an overall view, yes.
And at that juncture, I think now, if I don't call the store halt now, I'm getting the eye, I'm going to be in real trouble. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all of us now, big thank you to Joel for really stunning discussion, and somebody like me who wanders around Bletchley Park, almost one of those ghosts herself, and thinks, well, I know everything there is to know about gin delay lines and what have you. And then it's it's like coming at me like water through a fireman's hose, it's fantastic. So, big round of applause for Joel.